Today at the National Press Club, Australia's chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel. Dr. Finkel took up the posting after a long career as an entrepreneur, engineer and neuroscientist. He says Australia needs to get better at making money from its scientific know-how. Dr. Alan Finkel with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. I'm Chris Uhlmann and our guest today is the Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel. Please make him welcome. And if you are following us online, our hashtag is hashtag NPC and our handle is @PressClubAUST. You know, 100 years ago, there were biplanes dogfighting over the fields of France, and today scientists are planning trips to Mars. When this club was founded 50 years ago, if someone had told you to turn off the phone in your pocket, you would have been bewildered by the request. The 20th century ended with the rise of the computer age, and in this century we'll see biotechnology achievements that we have yet to dream of. We are surrounded by science, so much of it that sometimes it seems mundane. But it does raise great questions about where we should spend very scarce resources, and it also raises political and ethical questions. Alan Finkel has already bridged the gap between being a practitioner in science and communicating science, and now he is our advocate-in-chief. Dr. Alan Finkel, welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and I'd like to acknowledge Assistant Minister Karen Andrews and Assistant Minister Wyatt Roy, Senator Kim Carr, my wife, Elizabeth, some of my colleagues from my previous life, Professor Peter Gray, who's the President of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, Professor John Fitzgerald, the President of the Academy of Humanities, Belinda Robertson, the CEO of Universities Australia. Delighted that my friends from Science Meets Parliament and their President Jim Piper is here, and I can't resist, I have to do it. Hi, Mum. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start with a story about a small nation with middle power ambitions. It's a nation in transition. Its population is growing. Its commodity-based economy is booming on metals, on minerals and grain. That growth is supported by a strong financial sector and a sizable migrant workforce. It is underpinned by landmark tax reform, bedded down a few decades ago. But this small nation is well aware of its uncertain place in a strategic region at a volatile time. So it embarks on a bold exercise in next-generation defence procurement, a flagship for its Navy and a statement about its place in the world. The construction and the financing is a public-private partnership. The work, it's outsourced to a foreign company. That company subcontracts to an international consortium of SMEs. And then they head into an old-growth forest to source the materials. A forest because this ship will be built of oak. The setting is Sweden 400 years ago in 1625. Now, this was no ordinary ship that the Swedes contracted the Dutch, who subcontracted the Germans, the Danes and the Finns to build. This was something that no one in Sweden had ever attempted before. A 135-foot warship with 2 decks, each bearing 36 cannon. And it had to be built on the keel of the 110-foot single-deck warship the contractors were initially instructed to build. Now, that ship was half done when the king saw it, was excited, changed his mind, inspired by the thought of an extra deck with all those extra cannon. So the builders set to work, and they did their best to adapt the keel, while the king, he went off to fight the war with Poland. By August 1628, the ship was ready. All of Stockholm gathered at the harbour for the launch of this mighty symbol of Swedish pride. And all of Stockholm was there when, 20 minutes after the launch, nudged by a gentle breeze from the side, it sank, less than 1 nautical mile from where it was launched. Now, this ship, the Vasa, has sailed into business school history as the textbook case of innovation done wrong. Project specifications that changed at a political whim. A workforce of 400 people, which was the largest workforce ever engaged up until that time in a single project in Sweden. That workforce was split up into 5 autonomous project silos. There's been no discovery of any evidence of design plans. No prototype was built before the full-scale model. There was no appetite for frank and fearless advice, the giving or the receiving. And there was no testing until the very last moment, the last month. And then there was no courage to halt the launch when the test confirmed that the outcome was likely to be catastrophic. There was money squandered on vanity projects, including 20 busts of Roman emperors facing off against ornamental mermaids. And above all, not enough science. The ship and 53 lives were lost as a result. And when investors say to you that they are risk averse, here's the reason. No one wants to go down with the 2-deck ship. So you might say that it's risky to start a speech with failure, but I've actually never been afraid of risk. And I can tell you that no modern engineering team would build a ship like the Vasa. Of course, I'm assuming that at least one of the members of the engineering team would have come within spitting distance of Newton's laws of physics in the course of his or her training. But the Vasa was about 6 decades too early for Sir Isaac Newton. So the shipmasters, they didn't know about force vectors. They had no concept of a centre of gravity. So they were effectively blind, where modern science gives us the power to see. The more we know, thanks to science, the more that we can achieve through innovation, and the more efficient the path that we take to get there. Elizabeth and I, we visited the Vasa Museum in Stockholm in January of this year. And when I was there and I heard the story, I actually immediately knew that I would have to include it in my maiden voyage here as Chief Scientist at the National Press Club. So the first thing that the story of the Vasa says to me is this. If we want bold solutions in this century, then we need science and we need plenty of it. But as important as it is, science is not enough. We need to think about the interactions, the unexpected consequences, and the management of risk. If we were to build nothing new before we were absolutely certain that we knew the best way to do it, well, that would actually be the end of progress. And even if we did figure out the quantum world tomorrow, even if we did get a grip on the fantastical complexity of the human brain, even if we do crack nuclear fusion, if we achieve all of these, there would still be questions about the practical ways in which our knowledge may be applied. So, as an example, let's take self-driving cars. Now, I'm not drawing a parallel here to the Vasa. I know which of the two that I would rather travel in. It's not the one with ornamental mermaids. But I will put it to you that we are, in our own way, launching an untested craft into unknown waters, with consequences that we can only foresee in part. There are plenty of benefits when it comes to self-driving cars. Mobility for the elderly, fewer accidents, freedom to talk on your mobile phone, use your laptop on the way to work. But is it that simple? So let's imagine you've got a self-driving car and you're going to the city to attend a meeting. Do you pay for the car park? Or do you just tell the car to go round and round the block for the duration of your meeting? Congestion would skyrocket. Let's say it's 8 a.m. on a school day. Do you carpool, or do you pack the kids off and wait for the car to return? Again and again, more congestion. But the harder questions for government need only proceed from there. How do we deter people like me, or people who think like me, from adding to traffic congestion? And who do we allow to own or direct these cars? What happens to all the people who drive taxis and trucks for a living? Who builds and then who takes responsibility for the sophisticated networks of sensors that will support these cars? And given that orderly traffic flow depends on the interconnection between the cars and the traffic management software, what happens when the car hits an internet black spot? Potential catastrophe. So these are but a fraction of the issues attached to one technology in the immediately foreseeable future. To solve them, we need not just science, we need research, where research is the investigatory collaboration between science, technology, sociology, economics, and the like. In all the complex challenges that technology will bring, the humanities, the arts and social sciences are critical to our research endeavour, and we neglect them at our cost. And if we combine these research elements, we will reap the benefits. Gridlock, gone. Crashes, avoided. Car parks, repurposed. Designated drivers, extinct. Backseat drivers, forever silenced. And if you can imagine that self-driving car, then you can also imagine a low-emissions electricity grid supplying electric vehicles, connected to fantastic arrays of solar panels in the outback, travelling through an ever more exciting world. Perhaps by then we'll have made progress towards bionic eyes for the vision impaired, or launched trips into space for tourists. We could be living in an electric planet, a zero-emissions world. How much progress can our lives contain? We decide, and not just by the scope of our ambition, but by the breadth of our research, the quality of our planning, and the calibre of our leadership. So science is vital, and innovation takes hard work. Two lessons that a shipwreck can teach us. Learn them, and we will prosper in our own remarkable times. With great science, we will create great research outcomes. With clever innovation, we will turn those research outcomes into societal and economic benefit. And with great science and clever innovation combined, we can discover how truly remarkable we might be. Now, as a student, a researcher, an innovator and an investor, I've always tried to keep the doors of opportunity open. And I've reflected a great deal recently on what chasing opportunity means for public policy. After all, Australia has embarked on one of the most ambitious public sector innovation projects that we have ever attempted. Its aim is set out in the National Innovation and Science Agenda. We are seeking the design specifications for a very different sort of country. A country with the scientific potential, the industrial capacity and the start-up culture to thrive in the decades ahead. Above all, it's about thinking and operating at scale. If you recognise that a problem is big, you'll be more likely to develop appropriately large-scale solutions. For example, although Australia has the largest rate of rooftop solar installations in the world, the total contribution to our electricity needs is 2.1%. And electricity itself only represents approximately a fifth of our total energy needs, our total energy consumption. So the contribution of solar today is still very, very tiny. We have done wonders with solar from a virtual standing start in 2010. But to get to where we want to be, we need to move faster and with bigger ambitions. And operating at scale, it's not just about distributing money. The goal has to be to create an environment that encourages success. Take red tape. It's the gift wrap, if you like, for opportunity. For example, our existing regulations make it easier to test unmanned aerial drones here in Australia than it is for developers to test them in the United States. So we have an opportunity to be a leader rather than a follower in the use of drones for media, for mining, for retail, and for sport. Our regulations also support an efficient, world-class clinical trials industry, a national asset that we ought to celebrate. Every year, around 1,000 new clinical trials commence in Australia, capturing a $1 billion investment. But we don't create the same supportive environment for manufacturers of medical devices. We should be aiming to win on all fronts, in the interests of consumers as well as workers and investors. Beyond regulation, we need a highly educated workforce and tax regimes that are simple, reasonable and fair. We need to ensure that the government's contribution to the innovation system does not become too complex. And when designing an environment to encourage innovation, we need to declare in advance how we will measure success. We are capable of creating this environment, and where we succeed, good things will happen. So let me give you some examples that happen to have occurred in my first month on the job, and please, I do not take credit, but I do take note, and we should all take note. In basic science, we've just observed gravitational waves. Easy to say, but so difficult to do that Einstein himself thought that we would never crack it. To me, personally, this was the most exciting announcement in physics in my lifetime. It rounded out Einstein's theory of relativity. The event was observed on an instrument to which Australia made important contributions, an instrument that is the most sensitive combination of physics and engineering ever contemplated, let alone ever constructed. But most important, we now have a whole new way to observe the universe. More than 400 years ago, Galileo improved the optical telescope so that he could use it to prove that the Earth goes round the sun. In the 1930s, the radio telescope was invented, and it was eventually used to discover pulsars, quasars, and the cosmic background radiation. Now, the optical telescope and the radio telescope have been joined by the gravitational wave telescope. With it, we will discover things that we've never imagined. Back on Earth, in the marketplace, we've seen Australian science in translation in the form of a $730 million licensing deal in which the pharmaceutical giant Merck acquired rights to a new drug to treat lymphoma, sickle cell anemia, lung cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer. It's a wonder drug. And then the company Atlassian, it's powering on after sparking the dreams of 1 million ambitious young people when it listed on the United States Stock Exchange and reached $5.8 billion overnight. It's a classic story. It's 2 Sydney science and IT students who developed planning tools for software developers. It was a product that was so good that it sold itself without a sales force. All good news across the spectrum from scientific discovery to commercial success. Good news that stimulates the imagination. But if you think we've exhausted the tank, if you think that we've already optimised the policy settings, if you think that this is as good as it can get, well, you're not right. You're wrong. How many women give up on promising careers in science, technology, engineering and mathematics? Women comprise more than half of the science PhD graduates and early career researchers, but by the mid-30s, a serious gender gap begins to develop. We are improving, no doubt about it, but we have a long way to go. And how many businesses don't engage with universities or research agencies? Enough to rank us at the bottom of the OECD for cross-sector collaboration. How many researchers were never encouraged to think about working in industry or creating a startup in the course of their training? Too many, because we still set PhD students' sights on academic careers, even if for the majority we can't possibly satisfy the expectations that we create. And how many good ideas might be waiting to be turned into products or processes in our research facilities? We've got great universities, no doubt about it, but none of our universities are in the Thomson Reuters list of the top 100 university innovators. We rank 9th in the Global Innovation Index for the calibre of our science institutions, which is terrific, but 72nd in our innovation output. We're not capitalising on what we have. I'm telling you all this bad news because there's a silver lining. Just think what this country might achieve if we can address these issues. Then Australians can get on with bringing the future into the present. What are you going to do about this, Alan, you might be asking? Lots would be my simple answer. Enough to weigh down a speech like 36 cannons on a 17th century ship would be my longer answer. So let me signpost some of the work to expect from my office in the year ahead. First, there's my role at Innovation and Science Australia under Chairman Bill Ferris to help lead the development of a 15-year plan for investment in science, research and innovation. If adopted, it will be the strategic plan for the country, and it will be critical to coordinate the many moving parts in play. Second, Bill Ferris and I will be joined by John Fraser to undertake a review of the R&D tax incentive. Yes, it has been reviewed several times. But as we gather more data from the operation of the program, there is an opportunity to further refine the incentive to ensure that it is effective at encouraging R&D that would not otherwise take place. Third, I will be leading the development of a roadmap for our future national research infrastructure. The term research infrastructure, it's a little clunky because when we hear infrastructure, we usually think of the everyday things, the bridges, the ports, the railways that we know so well. We don't think of the infrastructure that maps the cosmos, images the brain, explores the oceans, and archives our history and our stories. But we should, because it enlarges our capacity to reach for the future. If endorsed, the proposed new infrastructure identified in the road mapping exercise will power Australian research in coming decades. And if history is our guide, powering science translates to fueling industry and putting Australian innovations out into the world. Fourth, there's the work of the Commonwealth Science Council, for which I am the Executive Officer. We will measure progress against the 9 national science and research priorities so we can answer to the expectations of Australians. We will identify our most transformational research and we will scope the future big opportunities for Australia. And finally, a word about education. I came to this role with the experience of creating 3 ongoing education programs, 2 in schools and 1 for early career researchers. So it makes sense that building on the Office of the Chief Scientist's existing capability, I intend to present the data that will help to elevate our ambition for Australian schools. We have to reverse the slipping rankings of our students in international tests. In 2007, we were ranked approximately 10th in the world across maths and science. But by 2011, these numbers had deteriorated and Australian students were significantly outperformed by students in 18 countries in science and 17 countries in maths. So being out of the top 10 is bad enough, but being on a downward trajectory is even worse. So what can we do to reverse this trend? Numerous concerned individuals, institutions and companies have created extracurricular activities to try to stimulate interest in science. My office has just published a listing of the extracurricular STEM activities across the country. And during the course of this year, we will work to make it available as a living database, accessible to all teachers, students and parents. But this won't be enough, because the challenge that we face, the scale of that challenge is huge. We need to enhance our in-curriculum teaching capability. We need to ensure that students learn deep content, not just how to learn. It's too glib to say that in the modern world, all you need to do is learn how to learn. And we need to challenge our students and support them to meet those challenges. So a lot to be done, all up. A 3-year term as Chief Scientist doesn't seem quite long enough. But as a travelling engineer, I've learned to pack efficiently, and I'll bring that skill, I hope, to the job. I began with the Wasser gunship, so I'll end with its postscript. It sat on the bottom of the harbour for 333 years. Then it was raised in 1961, almost perfectly preserved, ornamental mermaids and all. Raising it was a phenomenal feat of ingenuity and engineering. It was installed into a purpose-built museum where more than 1 million people every year line up to see it. To Sweden, the Wasser is now a great source of national pride. Because, you know what, Sweden didn't give up on building ships. They built 2-deck gunships. They built 3-deck gunships. Gunships that became the pride of the Swedish military for the next 30 years. They helped to usher in the age that the Swedes called Stormaktiden, the Great Power Period. Failure repurposed as a symbol of success. But we don't have to get there from the bottom of the harbour. Let's take the direct path to our own Stormaktiden, our own Great Power Period. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Finkel, thank you very much for that. And by my mark, you've navigated about 1 nautical mile from shore very successfully. This is where the shoals come in. And the gusts of wind. We're going to take some questions from the media. But you have asked us to think big today, so I might kick off with the big problem, climate change. We've seen politicians try and grapple with this, and there are different policy prescriptions from around the world. Is there any hope that there might be technology that comes to the rescue in some way? We've seen the rise of the Tesla battery. And is that move to renewables perhaps a little bit more difficult than some would have us believe?
Well, if you represent the shoals, they're dangerous. It's just such an important question. I guess 3 parts to answer your question. The global political will to collaborate on various initiatives. I really can't speak to it. It's something that politicians have to work out. We've, I think, seen a declaration of intent like we've never seen before at COP21 in Paris. It doesn't require enforceable activities and initiatives, but it certainly sets the stage for such things to come in later on. So in terms of changing the mood globally, I think it's really been pretty good. But mood itself won't solve the problems of climate change. There are 2 big areas where technology can help. One is on the energy productivity, or more specifically, the energy efficiency. It's the low-hanging fruit that people often refer to, and you see it all around. I'm not sure that you've got it here. I'm hot. I'm not sure that you've got LEDs yet in the National Press Club.
Blame the Managing Director.
But you know, most of us are converting to highly efficient lighting in industry and at homes, and that counts for a lot. You've seen over the last 20 years with the STAR initiative on appliances get much more efficient. Refrigerators are about 5-fold more efficient now than they were 50 years ago. Initially, when efficiency improves, you don't reap any benefits because people think, well, I can afford this. I'll get 2 refrigerators or I'll get a second television. But eventually they saturate their needs and you reap a permanent benefit. When I was driving around in Germany a few years ago, I was seeing a lot of building activities on what looked like multi-hundred-year buildings in good condition. They were mandating that even their heritage buildings had to be retrofitted with triple glazed glass because so much of, in their case, heat was being lost in winter. So there's a lot that we can do through encouraging or regulating around energy efficiency, and it's a no-brainer. It's hard to think. I actually can't think of any reason why we wouldn't be doing that on a systematic basis. But then the third part is what can we do in terms of new technologies? Mind you, I'm avoiding policies, but what can we do in terms of new technologies that can make the transition to a low emissions world practical? And I think that there's actually a lot that can be achieved. You mentioned Tesla in the context of intermittent power. We all know that solar and wind are fantastic in the sense they're clean and they're scalable. I said it's small so far, but that's off a standing start of 0 5 years ago. And if we commit to building out solar and wind, it's probably affordable over a 20 or 30-year period, and that's the sort of time frame you have to be thinking about. Nothing changes fast in the energy industry. It's just too big. It's like a ship that needs many, many tugs to turn it. But the prices have come down to the point where solar and wind as a generating source, they're quite competitive, and their prices will come down further. But the whole of system cost is very high. And that's why you see, for example, in Germany, I won't use local examples, but in Germany, the price of electricity is quite high because they've committed to intermittent renewable energy sources and they have to buy in electricity when the electricity's not there. So what we need now is to be investing in storage, developing storage technology. I see this as the moral imperative of our age. We've solved, and we should recognise victory, the generation challenge with solar and wind. But we have a long, long way to go on storage technology, and without it, solar and wind won't deliver what we really want. So it's not just Tesla, it's LG and Panasonic and most of the large battery manufacturers. They're all focused on building what we think of as large battery packs for your home so you could go off-grid or get more effective use. But even that needs to be scaled. And Tesla, for example, is famous because they've committed to building a gigafactory, is what they call it, a gigafactory to build their batteries. And the gigafactory, by the time it's finished in 2020, will cost about $5 billion US, not cheap. But it doesn't take a lot to work out that if you want to back up around the world, across the planet, solar and wind for the days when there's no wind and the nights and especially the winter periods where there's not much sun, you would need, and if you make some assumptions like 10-year life of the battery, you would need a couple of thousand Tesla gigafactories just to supply the batteries that we need. So do a couple of thousand times $5 billion US, and you end up with very, very big numbers. So it's expensive, but it's achievable over a multi-decade period, especially as the costs of building those batteries come down. And then it's a long answer, sorry, but the last part of the answer would be, if we work out how to do that, produce as much affordable zero emissions electricity as we need, why not triple it or quadruple it so we can use all of that extra electricity to replace the oil and petrol that we use in our vehicles for transport and all the natural gas that we use for heating in industry and in our homes, in our commercial buildings.
Okay, next question is from Australian Associated Press.
Elise Scott from AAP. Thank you for your speech, Dr. Finkel, and congratulations on the new gig. I also want to ask you about climate change, but slightly more specific. Last month at Estimates, you said that you were in conversations about maintaining Australia's climate change research capacity in the wake of the changes at the CSIRO. I was wondering if you might be able to provide us with an update on those conversations, and is it still your view that Australia's capacity hasn't been undermined yet, and do you think that that could be undermined into the future? Are you worried that there will be gaps after having those conversations?
So going back to the statement from Senate Estimates where I mentioned that I was in discussions, I am in discussions, and those are continuing, and I think they're continuing quite effectively. It's not a public forum, it's me trying to use my office to try to facilitate discussions between the key players in climate research in Australia. And they're all enthusiastically participating in that process. And I hope that by bringing all that intellectual horsepower into the one room, we can identify optimal ways forward. But you asked, am I, on the one hand, confident that Australia can deliver on its climate research obligations? On the other hand, do I feel that they're under threat? Well, of course, it's a bit of both, isn't it? Australia has tremendous climate research capabilities, and I think it's arguably the case that we represent the best climate research in the Southern Hemisphere. The CSIRO, for its own reasons, has had to make some reorganisational changes, not imposed by government, but it's had to make some organisational changes in order to pursue other areas, and that is impacting their ability to contribute. I don't want to trivialise that. It's really important things that they're doing there. But it is in the context of a lot of other climate research that takes place in Australia. So what we're trying to arrive at through this discussion group of the leaders in climate research from quite a few different areas is the best way to take into account what CSIRO is doing. Rely on the fact that they themselves have said that they are putting and will continue to put effort into coming up with translational systems or systems to enable them to translate some of what they are doing across to other people. If we can rely on that and the goodwill of these discussions, then I'm optimistic that we can continue to maintain our capacity. But it won't happen without a lot of effort. You know, these are serious issues.
To the Australian Financial Review.
Hi, Joanna Mather from the Australian Financial Review. You are one of the 3 Fs, I believe, reviewing the R&D tax incentive. What flaws have you observed in that scheme? And sort of related, you mentioned the landmark tax reform that had occurred in Sweden that allowed the Vasa experiment to occur. What is one thing that you would change about Australia's tax system to make it, or to encourage innovation?
So let me answer that specifically in the context of, innovation as you finished there. I'm not going to go into the broader issues of company tax rates and superannuation and everything else. So we do have an R&D tax incentive scheme which has been running for quite a few years and working quite well. It depends whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person, whether you see the increased expenditure in that system as evidence of its success or as perhaps evidence of it being overused and rorted. So we're looking at the R&D tax incentive not under a mandate to cut the cost to government. We're really looking at it under a mandate to look at 3 things. Does the R&D tax incentive as currently constructed have the integrity, efficiency and additionality that we would like it to have? Integrity in the sense, is it being rorted? And there's no evidence that it's being massively rorted, but could it be slightly improved? Maybe. Is it efficient? For a lot of the small companies who very legitimately benefit from it, there's quite a cost in preparing all the paperwork associated with it, and they inevitably end up paying that to highly paid tax consultants, and so the money that goes to the tax consultants, of course, is not being spent on the R&D. So we're looking at the efficiency of the system. But true to its intention, the most important thing about the R&D tax incentive is additionality. Is it encouraging additional or new research that might not otherwise have been undertaken without that financial encouragement through the R&D tax incentive? And I can't give you a formal answer on that. There is reason through our consultations to doubt that it's always doing as intended, and so we're deeply looking at that. On the other hand, we've seen good evidence where it's very effective, especially in very small companies that are spending 50 or 60% of their turnover on R&D. The issues are complex. Extensive surveys have been done. We've gone back and looked at earlier reports, and we're considering it, really with an open mind from the point of view of what will drive the intended outcome when it was first envisaged. And we're also cognizant of the fact that it's been tweaked from time to time, and there's tweak fatigue out there, and so we only want to do things if they will deliver value. But your question went on and talked about the broader question of what we can be doing to, in a sense, fund or support innovation in Australia. Compared to our other comparable countries across the OECD and some selected countries in Asia and Americas, we probably spend more through our government on indirect support of industry. Not probably, we do spend more on indirect support of R&D in industry than we do through direct support. So other countries, and America is a particular example of this, they actually, through competitive grant schemes and directed contracts, spend more to support business R&D than they do through tax foregone. So one of the things in the long term, and there's no immediate promise for addressing this, is to deal with that imbalance, if you like. But there are some good things already happening. I mean, we had some small schemes such as accelerating commercialisation, a little prototype starting up called BRII. But we also have the CRC scheme, in which government invests in industry research through collaborations, ARC linkage, the new CRCP scheme, and I think it would be legitimate to include the Biomedical Translation Research Fund that the government announced last December, $250 million going into co-invest with private industry. It would be legitimate to include that amount of money as a direct investment by the government in business R&D. So whilst it's our balance between indirect and direct is not as clear as it is in some other countries, it is moving in the right direction. I would hate to balance it by chopping off the tall poppy. We need to be investing in both areas.
Next up, the Adelaide Advertiser.
Dr. Finkel, thank you for the address today. You mentioned in your speech that you've never been afraid of risk. I'd like to ask you about the possibility of locating a nuclear waste dump in South Australia. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the major risks and also what the scientific benefit may be? And just quickly, do you have any comments on how we're operating electricity grids at the moment in order to reduce costs for customers in South Australia, for example?
I'll take them as two very, very separate questions. Look, the Royal Commission in South Australia has put forth its interim report, and it will be putting forth its final report, I think, in May. It's clearly done an extremely deep dive and careful investigation of virtually everything you can think about in terms of nuclear fuel cycle, including nuclear waste storage, or as you were asking about it, the high-level waste storage. And they have come to the conclusion that technologically it is an achievable thing to do, and if it was done, there's potentially a significant business opportunity for South Australia in storing other people's waste in South Australia. So as an engineer and scientist looking at what I see in that report and bring to bear my other knowledge, I have confidence in the technological analysis that was done in that report, and if you want to know more, of course, I refer you back to that report. But as the report itself pointed out, decisions about storing nuclear waste in South Australia and frankly anywhere are complex decisions that have to be made by politicians, ultimately take into account community values and community concerns and the economic practicality. So these are decisions that are way out of my purview, as they say, above my pay grade. If I did not feel confident that the technological analysis in that report was reasonable, if I felt that it was biased towards a predetermined outcome, I would speak up. But I think that it was an extremely well done report. So that's answering your question on nuclear.
The next one was on the electricity
And the next one was
grid.
on the price of electricity in South Australia. I think there are probably political and economic and market-driven reforms that could be done. But from the technology point of view, two things spring to mind. One is they have to invest in better connectors between Victoria and South Australia so that if they go into the doldrums and don't have wind because they are becoming quite reliant on large amounts of wind electricity on good days, they can purchase it effectively. And they've been caught out because there's only one connector at the moment. So doubling or tripling that connector would be a good thing to do. But then that invites consideration of the electricity market and the way standby electricity generation is costed in this country. For example, in the UK, the electricity market is set up such that somebody who builds a brand new natural gas generator is paid just for doing that and having it on standby, because natural gas generators, or natural gas turbines as they're called, can be switched on very, very quickly. And so they can act as the battery for wind power. If the wind drops, within a minute you can get those natural gas generators up to speed and provide all the electricity you want. It's not as clean as having wind, but it's certainly cleaner than coal, and so they've decided to invest in supporting that. But we don't do that yet in this country. So there would be microeconomic reforms, well, certainly in the electricity market reforms, that would assist to get some cost benefits and encourage people into the market, in addition to, say, the technological implementation of an extra second or third connector.
Just briefly on another kind of dump, a low-level nuclear waste dump, something the states asked the Commonwealth to look into in the 1970s, and every single one of them ever since has said, don't build it here. Can you tell us what kind of waste we're talking about there? Should people be terrified by that?
So, going back to the previous question, that was specifically about high-level waste, which we don't generate in this country, and so that would be a business opportunity to bring the waste in, bury it, and charge customers in Korea and India and other countries for doing that. What we do generate in this country is waste from our research reactors, and it's between low and medium grade waste, and waste from medical imaging or medical diagnostics, and in some cases medical therapy. When you hear radiotherapy, that's typically X-rays, it's not nuclear, but some therapies use radioisotopes, and that's a low-level nuclear waste. So the federal government has been looking at storing low-level nuclear waste somewhere, and that's the challenge. We already store this low-level and intermediate-level waste in dozens, maybe hundreds of places around the country, because when hospitals use these radioisotopes for diagnostic or therapeutic procedures, they can't just put them in the curbside waste bin. They have to store them, and they end up storing them on site. So we do have a situation where a lot of this low and intermediate waste is being stored in many places, and so far it's been effectively done, and credit to the industry that there's been no significant problem. But having that waste stored in multiple sites probably would be at a higher risk of something going wrong than if it was all being stored at one site with an enormous commitment to the procedures and the multi-hundred-year requirements around that centralised storage. So that's what's being discussed or considered by the federal government. It's in process. It's a decision that Josh Frydenberg, as the Minister for Energy and Resources, will have to take on board on behalf of the government. And it's going to be politically tough. There are social, state rights, economic issues. Better him than me.
Yeah, but it's already here, and it's in a hospital near you. Next to John Millard.
Thank you, Chris. John Millard from Artsound FM. Dr. Finkel, as well as being an innovative scientist, you're also an outspoken advocate of science awareness and popularisation. You're a patron of the, of interest to us, is that you're a patron of the Australian Science Media Centre and helped to launch and continue the popular science magazine Cosmos, which of course you do with your wife Elizabeth. It's interestingly, you're also an electrical engineer. Dr. Mike Gore was the founder and original director of Cresticon, the National Science and Technology Centre here in Canberra, done much to popularisation science, and he also is an electrical engineer. And so we can go back, possibly to Edison, and some people might say the original electrical engineer, Michael Faraday. Is there something particular about electrical engineers that make them both inventive scientists scientists and great popularisers of science? And if so, what is it?
Well, you know, I could ask you why you're even surprised by the fact that engineers would be interested in communication. I can do punctuation, I can construct sentences. You know, I can really only speak from my own point of view. I was born somehow with the genes that gave me passion for science. So as a young kid, I was doing the proverbial build a crystal set, and as a 10-year-old, I was buying Electronics Australia, which is a magazine on how to do home hobbies. And I've just always been interested in anything to do with physics, human body, ultimately neurosciences. And for me, it really is a stage of life. I've heard life described as being in 3 trimesters. You spend your first 30 years, it's all about me. It's growing up, getting your education. Your second trimester, the second 30 years, it's all about family and career. You know, investing in your children, your spouse, and your career. And the third trimester, which could be 30 years, or we hope a lot longer, is give back time. And so I really had the opportunity when I sold my company in America a bit over 10 years ago to actually consider what I was doing and realise that I enjoyed talking about the things that had been important to me. I felt that my career had been successful because of my education here in Australia, both at school and university, in my Monash University years. I did my postdoc at ANU, and they all contributed to what I became, and so I wanted to give back to Australian society. I am married to a woman who is naturally gifted in communication, and so around about that time that I was in give back mood, we had a lot of discussions and decided Australia needed a more literary science magazine. So Elizabeth and myself and 2 others co-founded Cosmos magazine, and it's just been a joy to be associated with that magazine over the years. I'm no longer involved. I've relinquished all of my previous activities in order to take up this role, and Elizabeth is delighted. She's got free rein as editor-in-chief to do whatever she wants, and she's driving it forward as appropriately as you would expect.
To Canberra IQ.
Simon Groves from Canberra IQ. Speaking of learning from failure, in the 30 years or so that I've been either involved in or closely following the R&D sector and the area of public policy in terms of research, a key goal has been to increase the interaction between industry and research. And as you said in your speech, we're now, I think we've gone backwards. We're 33 out of 33 OECD countries on that metric. Now, in that time, there's been billions and billions spent, lots of innovation statements and hubs and CRCs and this. If you had a 30-year research project and you spent billions on it and you got nowhere, you would tend to think maybe we should stop doing this research. So can you give us any pointers as to any new ways that you and the other 2 Fs can change the culture in Australia or support a change in culture to actually change our performance?
So there are a few things that are already underway, but we've not seen the benefit of them yet because they're still in either pilot or planning stage. So last year and the year before, I was president of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, and with Peter Gray and other colleagues in the Academy, we put forward a proposal to try to encourage engagement from universities to industry. And we piloted that in all the universities in Queensland and in South Australia, and it was quite successful in its pilot. And it has been identified by the government in the innovation statement last December as having indicated the importance, or shown them the importance of encouraging university and medical research institute researchers to reach out. And it's going to be developed over the next year or 2 by the ARC into a more formal plan. What it's trying to address is that through the international rankings and through our own Australian ranking, called the ERA, we've become very, very focused on publications and citations to the extent that there's an unanticipated side effect that researchers actually, in some cases, not all, some cases, resent the time spent to, if they were to invest in working with industry, they resent the time spent there because it doesn't lead to publications and citations. So what we're trying to do with the new indicator is balance that out and give them credit for engagement activity to live alongside the absolutely appropriate credit that they get for the core research that is visible through their publications and citations. In addition to that, through the review led by Ian Watt into university block funding last year, they adjusted the formula for block funding, and so now universities will get some of their indirect research funding based on a formula that includes industry engagement in addition to how they've been doing in research. So these will change culture because vice-chancellors will say, we need this money. Money can influence behaviour for sure. There is a possibility that we've talked about through the R&D tax incentive to look at ways of using the R&D tax incentive itself to encourage the opposite direction, industry to reach into research institutes. But I can't speak to that because absolutely nothing has been agreed. Even the idea, there's no commitment to do that. And if there was, how would it be done? But there is consideration. We're well aware of the problem. And the last thing I'd say is I'm seeing good evidence of industry itself wanting to reverse the trends of the last 20 years. So Woodside is investing in innovation centres at some of our universities. Cisco is doing that big time. Some of the international drug companies, Pfizer and GSK, are working with Australian universities, American companies. There's sort of, off a low base, there's a significant increase. So we've got a long way to go. But I think with the promotion of the need for taking a bit of a risk, working with industry, the cultural change that's starting, combined with some of these monetary encouragements, we could be entering an era where there'll be significant cultural change.
All right, time is rushing on. We'll take two more questions.